this next video, what we're going to talk about is what types of foods would you go to find the various categories, the 6 categories of nutrients that we talked about in the first video. Figuring out what foods have which nutrients is very difficult, and it's a lot of memorization that's going to take a lot of practice over the semester. So if you can master these basic concepts, you will find that with some embellishment, especially when it comes to the vitamins, this will allow you to look at a meal and have a pretty good idea of whether it has a lot of one particular type of nutrient or another. Okay, so the way that I'm going to do this is to use a trick, an educational trick, where I'm going to ask you to begin with what you think. A lot of us bring to the table, that's a nutrition joke, bring to the table things that we've been taught over our lives. And when we're taught things for the first time around, there's sort of a simplistic way that we learn things. And although there's modifiers, it's easier for us to remember the simple thing. And I think you may be surprised to see that a lot of what you think is right, yes, but there are some things that you think that are a bit skewed just because you learned the simplified version of it. So what I'm going to do is ask you, as I introduce each of the nutrient categories, to start with taking a guess. What do you think the answer is? And then I'll show you the answer, and we'll talk about it a little bit before we move on to the next one. Okay, so what we're going to do is start with carbohydrates. Remember, carbohydrates include sugar and includes starch and includes fiber. Those are the types of carbohydrates that we're going to find in food. So if you had to take a guess, what would you guess where carbohydrates are found? Are they found only in food from plants, only from animals, more in one than the other, equally in both? Okay, take a minute and think about that. So what's the answer? Well, carbohydrates are found in plants, and if I had to guess, that's probably the one that you know about. If you think about grains, that's our major source of carbohydrates. Pasta is made from wheat, potatoes have starch in them, and all of these are plant foods. Sugars, where do they come from? Fruits are sweet. They have a lot of sugar in them, and those are indeed from plant sources as well. All plants make carbohydrates. Animal sources, on the other hand, as a rule, don't have carbohydrates in them. They're not present in significant quantities from a nutritional standpoint. There's one exception, which is dairy products. Okay. So why? Why is it that plants, except for dairy products, are the only source of carbohydrates in our diet? It helps to think through the logic as to why these nutrients are distributed the way they are from a biological point of view. It's a lot more permanent than memorizing lists. So what I'd like to do is just talk about, from a biological perspective, why this makes sense. Remember that plants are primary producers, whereas animals rely on other organisms for their food sources. They eat other organisms. Plants, what they do is they take the sunlight and use it to make sugar. and then the sugar is in turn fed into their mitochondria, and that's how they make their ATP. So animals, on the other hand, don't make sugars. We don't photosynthesize, although that would be really cool if we could. But we don't. So what we do is we get the sugars from plants. Or if you are a carnivore, you don't get any sugars or carbohydrate or starch in your diet. The only way that you can get the carbohydrates that you need is if you can take proteins and turn them into sugars. So carnivores and omnivores have the enzymes to do just that. So we can turn proteins into sugars, but we can't make sugars ourselves. So with the sugars that we make, we have to have some. What we do is we export them, and it circulates around in our blood. When you think about the foods that we like to eat, except for a few products and a few cultures, people don't tend to eat blood. It's not something that we particularly enjoy. And so since that's where you're going to find the carbohydrates that we make, that's why you'll never get them from animal sources. Now, what plants do is during the day, they're making their sugar, and the sugar that they make flows through their circulatory system, which is the xylem and phloem, and that's what they need for their use for their immediate needs. But in the middle of the day, lots of sunlight coming in, they're going to end up with more sugar than they can use immediately. So what they do with that excess is they take the sugars and they chain them together into a polymer that's called starch. And that starch gets deposited in places where they store their energy, primarily in their leaves, and for certain types of plants, if they have starchy roots in their roots. Think potatoes. That's what potatoes are. Animals don't make starch. We store our energy differently, and so that is why you will never bite into animal food and get starch out of it. Now, the other part of the life cycle in plants to think about is the next generation. So during the day they're using sugar. At night, and when it's cloudy outside, they dig into their starch reserves. But plants need to think about providing energy to the next generation, and the next generation is seeds. So from a plant's point of view, you got to give your progeny some sort of energy source so that it can survive the embryo stage and put out those leaves and start making energy for itself. So what plants will do is they will take some of that starch that they've made and deposit it in their seeds. So you will find starch in seeds, and it's there not because plants really want to help us out by making wheat grain for us, but it's there for their babies. Mammals, on the other hand, I'm not going to talk about other organisms other than mammals. If you think about how it is that our embryos, our progeny, get their nutrients until they can be self-sufficient, like, holding down a job at Walmart and pulling in a salary, they start out in utero getting all of their nutrients through the placenta. And then how does the placenta get nutrients? From the mother's bloodstream. And then once the baby is born, until it can feed itself, the babies are given breast milk, and that's how they get their nutrients. So because we don't eat blood, we don't eat placenta, that leaves milk as the only source where you're going to find sugar. So putting that together, where are carbohydrates found? They're found primarily in plant foods because plants are the only ones that make them. Because we don't eat blood, and milk is the only animal source where you will find carbohydrates. Alright, so let's take on the next category, namely lipids. What would you guess is the distribution of lipids in plants versus animals? I'm guessing that you said animals have lipids, and indeed they do. Fat is a visible part of meat when you buy it in the supermarket. It's usually present as a rind around the edge of a cut of meat, but it's also sometimes marbled throughout it. And another type of food that we eat that's in the meat department at the supermarket is liver. And liver has a lot of fat in it. When you are eating pate, which is made from liver, you're mainly eating fat. Lard is a type of solid fat that's used for cooking that also comes from an animal source and makes the best pie crust. Dairy foods have fats in them, unless you have fat-free milk. And then eggs. In eggs, the fat is primarily localized to the yolk. However, plants also have fats in them. The place where plants have oils, because in plants the fats are present in liquid form, the place where you're mainly going to find oils are in the seeds. And for trees, the seeds are the nuts. Plants put oils into their seeds for the same reason that plants put starch into their seeds. It's fuel, energy source for the next generation. Only some plants do it, though. It's not universal. And if you think about vegetable oils, where do they come from? Sesame oil, sunflower oil, corn oil, all of those are the seeds. Wheat germ is also oily, has some oil in it. We usually don't have much contact with wheat germ because wheat germ is stripped off of the wheat when we make it into, when it's made into white flour, and that's mainly what Americans eat is bread products or wheat products made from white flour. So the germ is the portion of the wheat seed that actually contains the oils. There's also a few things that we call that are fruits that have fat in them. Not very many, though. The coconut is one. Olives have oil in them, and that's how we get olive oil, of course, not from the seeds. And the avocado, the flesh of the avocado fruit, has a pretty high fat content, too. Why? I think I've gone through some of these reasons already. Plants use starch and not lipids for the major part of their life cycle, but for us on a day-to-day basis we draw on fats as our energy store when we're not actively taking in food. If plants do store energy as oils, it will only be some of the plants, and those oils will only be found in their seeds and in their fruits, not in the main part of the plant, not in the leaves, not in the stems. So the answer is lipids are found, you might think, equally in plant and animal foods, because I mentioned a lot of plants, I mentioned a lot of animals. But if I were to modify this, remember that the number, when you think about how much we eat of the various types of fruits and vegetables, most of the fruits and vegetables that we eat are fruits that don't have fat in them, tomatoes, cucumbers, or the leaves like lettuce, or the stems like onions, or that's actually, some of them are roots. The stems are carrot, that's another root. Celery. Celery is a root. Okay. So while you shouldn't forget that it's possible to get lipids from plants, they're not always guilt-free. I would say that primarily the main source in the American diet of fats, of lipids, is in animal foods, and that's why we have that impression. So let's take on the last one, which is proteins. Where would you guess that proteins would be found? Only in plants, only in animals, more in one than the other, or equally? Proteins are found in animal sources, and that's the one that we know the best. Meats are a source of protein. Dairy products have meat in them, and eggs. Protein is distributed in the egg white, and in the egg yolk. But plants have protein too. The richest source of plant proteins are going to be in a group of plants called the legumes. These are the beans and peas. Grains also have protein in them, but less so than the legumes. And then what you might call the classic vegetables, the leaves, the stems, the fruits, they have protein in them too, but less so than legumes or grains. So why is that? Let's talk about the animal foods first. What we call meats is mostly, what we sink our teeth into is muscle. Most of the foods that we eat, except for liver, is muscle. So what is muscle? Muscle is a collection of cells which are called muscle fibers, and inside the muscle cells are these fibers that are composed of long chains of two different types of protein, myosin and actin. And when muscle moves, what happens is these chains of myosin slide past the actin chains with these little feet that hold on to each other. It's kind of cool. And that's what muscle is. So going backwards, if the fibers are chains of nothing but protein, and most of the bulk of the muscle cells is composed of these fibers, and muscle is composed of muscle cells, when you bite into muscle meat, you are mainly eating actin and myosin. Okay, we use muscles a lot. We use them because we move. Our heart moves, our motor muscles move. We get around. Plants, on the other hand, have a very different lifestyle. They don't move. They have different ways of doing things. And so they don't need these deposits of actin and myosin like we do. Now, why is it that legumes, the class of proteins of plants that are called legumes, have more protein in them? The reason is that legumes, what makes them legumes, is they have the enzymes needed to take nitrogen gas from the air and turn it into a form of nitrogen that they can use. That's called nitrogen fixation. So because they can make nitrogen from the air, they don't have as hard of a time getting nitrogen to make proteins as other plants. Other plants, they have to pick up nitrogen sources from the ground, and that's kind of hard to come by unless you have some compost or decomposing plant material on the ground. Plants rely on the ground to get their nitrogen from. Nitrogen is important for making proteins because every single amino acid has at least one molecule of nitrogen in it. That's part of the amino acid chain. So nitrogen is limiting when organisms are trying to make protein. So because legumes can make their own nitrogen for amino acids, they can make lots of it, and they do. They've adapted a way to take advantage of that. So that is why legumes have more protein in them. Okay, and then that leaves all of the other plant sources. All organisms make proteins. Proteins are, as we're going to learn, they are used to build the structure of cells, maybe not to the extent of the structure of protein-rich structure of muscles, but there is protein all over the place inside every cell. So when you're eating a plant of any type, you are eating cells, and all cells are going to have proteins in them. So while probably you might have thought from that slide that plant and animal foods are equally have equal amounts of protein, as you're going to learn later on in the semester, plants have protein in them, but they are not as digestible as animal proteins, and also the distribution of amino acids within plant foods is not ideal match to what we need. So while plants may have as much protein, certain plants, animal foods are more protein rich for those two reasons, digestibility and amino acid content. All right, so what does that leave? That leaves the micronutrients. So vitamins, minerals, and water. Where are they found? The answer for the micronutrients is very simple. They're found in all food groups: vitamins, minerals, and water. So the complication is that while plants and animal foods have all of that, each member of that category may have a different selection of vitamins. So in animal foods are the only source of a particular vitamin called B12. That's the only place that you're going to find it. Plants, if you go down the list of the vitamins and minerals, you will find that, say, spinach has vitamin A, it has iron, but it's lacking in, say, vitamin B6. So as you go through the plants, you'll find that there are some plants that are more rich in some vitamins, some plants that are more rich in others, and so the idea that all vitamins are found equally in all plants and all animal foods is a simplistic view. If you were to just count vitamins and how many vitamins are found in plant foods only, how many vitamins are found in animal foods only, and the same with minerals, you will find that plant foods have more, there's more vitamins, more of the vitamins that are found in plant foods than in animal foods. When it comes to water, though, water is found equally, pretty much equally, in plants and animal foods. So in summary, plants, when we're looking for those things where it's either one or the other, starch, rock solid, only comes from plants. Same with sugar, with one exception, dairy. You will never find sugar or starch in animal foods, except for dairy. When you're thinking about fat and protein, animal foods tend to have a higher fat and a higher protein content than plant foods. But that doesn't mean that plants don't have fat or protein. They're just, for proteins, less digestible, not ideal match to ours. And for the fats, while fat is found in almost all of the meats that we eat, fats are only found in certain organs of a plant. When it comes to vitamins and minerals, you will find that when you eat plant foods, you get a longer list of vitamins from plant foods than you can get from animal foods. But there are some vitamins that you can only get from animal foods. And finally, water. Just a striking figure, water makes up 75% of meats. So when you're thinking about your intake of liquids, and you're probably thinking mainly, what am I drinking? We actually get a lot of our water from the foods that we eat. The scale is slightly tipped on the side of fruits and vegetables. They have a little bit higher water content than meats, but 75% is still a huge volume. All right, so what I would suggest now is that you take what we just went through and take a look at your concept map that I had you make in that last video. See if it makes sense to reorganize your concept map to incorporate the new things that we've learned about the sources of foods. So one idea might be, what would it look like if you took and reorganized your concept map using food sources as categories instead of the 6 nutrient types? Would that be a good way to fit in these ideas? Another thing that you might think about is, what if you took the concept map that you've already made and using, I like to use colored pens, put a circle, a big circle that loops all of the boxes that come from the various sources. That's a way to put in that information without necessarily redoing it all. And then another way that you might think about is think not about plant and animal sources, but think instead of some of the categories that I've been talking about: seeds, fruits, legumes, dairy. What would it look like if you reorganized your concept map or started over a new one using those as the organizing categories instead of the nutrient categories? Would that make it a more compact and easier to understand map? So that's the end of this particular video. When you're ready, There's another video that a couple more videos I'd like for you to watch from this chapter, and the next one is about measuring energy yields.